It was supposed to be the beginning of a new era, the dawn of commercial jet travel, sleek, fast, and silent. In the early 1950s, Britain stood proudly at the front of aviation innovation. The world was still recovering from the ashes of war, but engineers were already dreaming of a future where the skies would belong not to soldiers, but to travelers. The name of that dream was the de Havilland Comet, the first commercial jet airliner in history. It promised to shrink the planet, to make continents feel like neighbors. For a moment, humanity believed that flight had finally conquered the impossible. The comet didn't just represent speed, it represented progress. Newspapers called it the pride of Britain, the plane of tomorrow, the miracle in the clouds. In 1952, when the first passengers boarded the Comet for its inaugural flight, they were stepping into history. Polished aluminum skin reflected the sun, engines hummed with a sound no one had ever heard before, the smooth roar of jet propulsion. People watched from the tarmac in awe, unaware that beneath the elegant curves and confident smiles, something was deeply, fatally wrong. But no one could have known it yet. Not the pilots, not the passengers, not even the men who built it. This is Black Box Files, where every story has wings and every wing hides a story. Subscribe and stay with us until the end, because today we reopen the case of the Comet, the plane that exploded in the sky, and no one knew why. At first, everything seemed perfect. The Comet flew higher, faster, and smoother than any aircraft before it. It could cruise above the weather where turbulence barely touched it. Pilots loved its responsiveness, passengers adored the luxury, and airlines raced to order fleets. For the first time in human history, flying didn't feel dangerous. It felt glamorous. The world watched as the Comet became the symbol of a new, modern age. But within 2 years, that symbol of triumph would turn into a symbol of tragedy. The first sign came quietly, almost ignored. On the 2nd of May 1953, a Comet operating as BOAC Flight 783 took off from Calcutta, India. It climbed smoothly into the sky, engines roaring through the humid air. Then, 9 minutes after takeoff, witnesses on the ground saw something impossible. A bright flash, and pieces of burning metal falling from the clouds. The aircraft had disintegrated mid-air, scattering wreckage across miles of countryside. There were no survivors. The investigation that followed was confusing. The weather was calm. The pilot had given no distress call. Maintenance records were clean. The Comet was, by all appearances, flawless. Experts blamed turbulence, then pilot error, then an engine fire. The truth was none of these, but no one was ready to admit it. For de Havilland, the disaster was a blow, but not yet a death sentence. The company reassured the public, modified a few systems, and sent the jets back into service. They believed in their creation, believed that one tragic event could not define the future. And so, the Comet flew again. But the sky was not done speaking. On January 10, 1954, just 8 months later, BOAC Flight 781 lifted off from Rome, bound for London. 35 passengers relaxed in their seats as the Comet climbed over the Tyrrhenian Sea. The morning sun glinted off the wings. The pilots exchanged routine radio messages with air traffic control. Everything was calm. Then, without warning, the radio went silent. Fishermen on the water below saw a flash, a burst of white fire, followed by debris raining from the heavens. The sea boiled with wreckage and smoke. Within minutes, it was over. The Comet was gone. The rescue ships arrived quickly, but what they found shocked them. The pieces of the aircraft were not burned, as one might expect from an explosion. They were twisted, torn apart, as if ripped open by invisible hands. Bodies showed no signs of fire or smoke inhalation. Death had come instantly through explosive decompression. The question haunted investigators. How could a pressurized cabin simply tear itself apart at 30,000 feet? The world began to whisper, Maybe the comet wasn't ready. Maybe mankind had reached too far, too fast. In London, the Air Accidents Investigation Branch began what would become one of the most exhaustive inquiries in aviation history. Thousands of fragments were recovered from the sea. Engineers laid them out in hangars, reassembling the plane piece by piece like a deadly puzzle. It was a monumental task and an emotional one. Each piece of torn metal was a clue, each rivet a potential confession. At first, investigators suspected sabotage or fatigue in the engines, but the engines, when recovered, were mostly intact. The real culprit seemed hidden somewhere in the fuselage, the body of the aircraft itself. That was when one man made a fateful observation. The pattern of tearing metal suggested that the fuselage had burst from the inside out. This was something new, something no one in aviation had ever seen before. The Comet, it seemed, had failed not because of fire or collision, but because the air inside it had escaped violently into the void. The cabin pressure had blown the plane apart. But why? Jets flew higher than propeller planes, requiring cabins to be sealed tight and pressurized to simulate conditions closer to sea level. Every time a comet ascended, the air inside pushed outward on the aluminum skin, and every time it descended, the pressure eased. It was like inflating and deflating a balloon hundreds of times, but the human eye cannot see the invisible cracks that live within metal. The company complied reluctantly, confident they would soon return to the skies. But even as engineers tested the aircraft in laboratories, another tragedy struck. On April 8, 1954, South African Airways Flight 201, another Comet, took off from Rome, following almost the exact same path as Flight 781 3 months earlier. It never reached its destination. Once again, the aircraft exploded in mid-air over the Mediterranean. Once again, there were no survivors. The Comet was grounded indefinitely. The disaster sent shockwaves through the aviation world. Britain's dream of leading the jet age crumbled overnight. Rival manufacturers in the United States, Boeing and Douglas, quietly took note. The age of British dominance in the skies had ended, and a new era of American engineering was about to begin. But in laboratories and hangars across Britain, the investigation continued. Engineers knew they were dealing with something unprecedented. They built full-scale mock-ups of the Comet's fuselage, placed them inside enormous water tanks, and subjected them to repeated cycles of pressurization and depressurization, simulating years of flight in just weeks. It was during these tests that the truth finally surfaced. Tiny cracks began to appear around the corners of the plane, S-square windows, almost invisible at first, then spreading like spider webs with each simulated flight. The stress of repeated pressurization had weakened the metal along these sharp corners, and eventually those cracks joined together. One moment the plane was intact, the next it ripped itself apart. A simple design choice, square windows instead of rounded ones, had doomed the world's first jet airliner. It was an engineering oversight that no one had anticipated. Over time, that pressure became fatal. The discovery stunned the aviation community. It was elegant in its simplicity, horrifying in its consequence. The Comet's tragedy rewrote the rules of aircraft design. Every plane built afterward, from the Boeing 707 to the Airbus A320, would carry the lessons learned from those burning skies. Rounded windows became the new standard, and engineers learned to respect the invisible limits of the materials they used. The world had entered the jet age, but it came at a terrible price. In the wake of the disasters, de Havilland tried to recover. They redesigned the Comet with thicker metal, reinforced joints, and, most importantly, round windows. The aircraft eventually returned to service in 1958, safer and stronger than before. But by then, it was too late. The damage to Britain's reputation and to public trust was irreversible. The Comet's successors, the Boeing 707 and the Douglas DC-8 would dominate the skies for decades. The Pioneer had fallen so that others could fly. Still, the legacy of the Comet remains. Its wreckage taught the world what it truly means to push the boundaries of technology. Innovation, after all, is not born in success, but in failure. And perhaps, if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The faint echo of engines above the Mediterranean, the ghost of a plane that tried to touch the future before the world was ready. The investigation into the Comet disasters would soon become one of the most complex and emotionally charged inquiries in the history of aviation. In a hangar at Farnborough, engineers and investigators laid out the twisted remains of Flight 781 on a massive floor grid. Every piece of wreckage, no matter how small, was labelled, catalogued and positioned according to its original place in the aircraft. It was a grim mosaic of failure, but also a map to the truth. They called it the puzzle of the skies. In the centre of the investigation stood Sir Arnold Hall, a man of quiet determination and intellect, the head of the Royal Aircraft Establishment. He understood that the future of British aviation depended not only on finding the cause of the crashes, but on restoring faith in technology itself. To Hall, the Comet was not just a machine, it was a promise. And promises, when broken, demand answers. Weeks turned into months. Every test, every piece of evidence pointed to a mystery deeper than anyone had expected. There were no clear signs of fire, no sabotage, no structural flaws that could be easily explained, and yet something was tearing these aircraft apart at altitude. Engineers began to suspect fatigue, not in the engines or wings, but in the very skin of the aircraft. This was a revolutionary thought at the time. Metal fatigue was a concept known in theory, but not yet fully understood in practice, especially in an era when aviation had leapt forward so fast that even science struggled to keep pace. To prove it, they needed an experiment that could simulate the pressures of flight. The British government authorized the creation of a gigantic water tank, a structure large enough to fit the entire fuselage of a Comet. There, under controlled conditions, engineers would recreate the cycles of flight, pressurizing the cabin to match the forces at altitude, then releasing it to simulate descent. Again and again, dozens of times a day, for weeks, for months, they would compress years of wear into days of observation. It was an extraordinary act of scientific endurance, but the world was waiting for answers, and Britain's reputation was on the line. The press called it the Great Experiment. To the engineers, it felt like an autopsy of a ghost. As the machine breathed in and out, metal moaned under invisible strain. Each cycle whispered a question. How much pressure can a dream endure before it breaks? For a long time, nothing happened. Then, during one of the late-night cycles, the sound changed. A dull pop, almost like a sigh. The engineers froze. Water began to ripple. A crack had appeared near one of the window corners. It spread in slow motion, creeping like lightning across the fuselage until the metal gave way entirely. The cabin exploded within the tank. It was over. The culprit had finally revealed itself. The square windows, designed to look elegant and modern, were fatal. At each corner, stress had concentrated, eating away at the aluminum every time the plane climbed or descended. What looked like simple geometry had become a trap. The engineers had unwittingly created the perfect weakness, one that no one could see until it was too late. The discovery was as horrifying as it was brilliant. The investigators had solved the mystery, but at the cost of hundreds of lives. The report that followed was precise, unforgiving, and humbling. The de Havilland Comet, it stated, had been a masterpiece ahead of its time, but its design underestimated the long-term effects of pressurization on thin metal structures. The square windows, sharp-edged cutouts for radio aerials, and certain riveting techniques all contributed to a pattern of stress that ultimately tore the aircraft apart. The finding forced every manufacturer in the world to rethink what they knew about flight. It was no longer enough to make planes that could fly. They had to endure. Every ascent, every descent, every vibration had to be accounted for. From that day on, the term fatigue testing became a cornerstone of aircraft design. De Havilland's engineers, once heroes, now carried the weight of guilt. They had given the world the future, but misjudged its fragility. Sir Geoffrey de Havilland himself faced a storm of criticism, though many acknowledged that his team had ventured into uncharted territory. In interviews, he spoke of the Comet as both triumph and tragedy, a reminder that innovation always carries risk. "We built the world's first jet airliner," he once said, "and it taught us lessons written in blood." The words echoed through the corridors of British industry, somber and unforgettable. As the investigation concluded, the grounded comets sat silently at airports across the globe, monuments to ambition and error. Engineers from Boeing and Douglas visited the wreckage, taking notes. In Seattle, Boeing's 707 project accelerated, incorporating lessons learned from the Comet's failures: thicker skin, rounded windows, reinforced joints. In Long Beach, Douglas engineers did the same for the DC-8. The tragedy of the Comet, painful as it was, had cleared the path for a safer future. The skies would soon belong to new giants, built on the bones of Britain's broken dream. In Parliament, debates raged. Some called for the entire British aviation programme to be dismantled. Others defended it as a national treasure too important to abandon. The government faced a dilemma: admit to the world that British engineering had failed, or stand behind the scientists who had pioneered it. Ultimately, they chose transparency. The full investigation report was published and made available internationally. It was an act of humility that stunned the world and earned respect from rival nations. Britain had faced its failure head-on and in doing so preserved its integrity. Publicly, the loss was immense. Airlines cancelled orders, passengers feared flying, and confidence in jet travel plummeted. But in laboratories and universities, something extraordinary began to happen. A new generation of engineers studied the Comet case with obsession. They analyzed the patterns of stress, the materials, the rivets. They built mathematical models, ran simulations, and tested new alloys. The ghost of the Comet became a teacher, guiding them towards safer skies. By 1958, when the redesigned Comet 4 took to the air, it was not just an aircraft. It was a symbol of rebirth. Round windows gleamed under the sun, the fuselage reinforced with the scars of hard-won knowledge. It flew safely for years, carrying passengers quietly across oceans. Yet even in success, the memory of those who perished haunted every flight. Each smooth ascent was a silent tribute to the cost of progress. The world had entered the jet age because of the Comet, but it was the Comet's destruction that ensured the jet age would survive. In a way, it achieved immortality through failure. No other aircraft would ever teach so many lessons in such a short time. Every whistle of the wind over a jet window, every sigh of pressure equalizing in the cabin, carried within it the legacy of those first explosions over the Mediterranean. The final words of the official report summed it up best. The Comet was the pioneer of jet transport. Its failure has given the world knowledge for which it will be forever in debt. The engineers who read that line stood in silence. For them, it was not consolation, it was confession. In their quest to master the sky, they had been reminded that the sky is never truly mastered. It allows humanity to rise, but only on its own terms. The Comet's remains were eventually moved from the hangar to a museum, where they rest even now, twisted metal, silent witnesses to the day the future came too soon. Visitors walk by without always understanding the significance, but the story remains alive in every aircraft that followed. The 707, the Concorde, the Dreamliner, they all owe their existence to the lessons of that ghostly jet. As the decades passed, the world forgot the fear, but engineers never did. In classrooms, the story of the comet became mandatory learning, a case study in humility, a warning about the dangers of progress without patience. Its name became a symbol of both brilliance and blindness. And in every corner of the aviation world, one phrase lingered like an echo: remember the comet. The skies grew safer, faster, louder. Humanity reached the stratosphere and beyond. But every time a plane breaks through the clouds, somewhere, deep inside the heart of the machine, metal remembers. The sky remembers. In the years that followed the comet disasters, the shadow of those explosions stretched far beyond the hangars of Farnborough. It reached into boardrooms, ministries, and foreign capitals. The death of the comet was not only a technological failure, it was a political earthquake. Britain had gambled its post-war identity on innovation. The comet was to be the flag-bearer of a new industrial empire built not on colonies, but on ideas. Its collapse tore a hole through national pride. The newspapers that had once called it the miracle in the sky now used darker headlines: Britain's dream in ruins. The tragedy became a mirror reflecting a painful truth. Even the most advanced nations could be humbled by their own ambition. Inside the House of Commons, voices clashed. Some argued that de Havilland should be stripped of government contracts. Others insisted that only by continuing to innovate could Britain reclaim its position in the sky. Geoffrey de Havilland, older now, spoke rarely in public. When he did, his voice carried the exhaustion of a man who had flown too close to his own dream. Behind closed doors, engineers who had once toasted the comet's success now sat in silence, haunted by the ghosts of their calculations. They had designed perfection, or so they thought. But perfection is a fragile thing when it meets the invisible hand of time and pressure. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Americans were watching. Boeing and Douglas engineers followed every British report with obsessive precision. They learned the lessons without paying the price. Their prototypes grew larger, faster, stronger. The Boeing 707, still on the drawing board when the comet first flew, began to take shape with reinforced structures and round windows. The disaster that destroyed one nation's legacy became the foundation of another's dominance. It was a bitter irony that history would not forget. The 707's first flight in 1957 was everything the comet had once promised: smooth, powerful, and safe. American newspapers hailed it as the birth of the jet age, quietly overlooking that the true birth had already taken place years before, over the skies of Rome and Calcutta in fire and silence. By the time the Comet 4 returned to service in 1958, Boeing had already captured the global market. Airlines that had once ordered comets now placed their faith in American steel and American engines. The jet age belonged to the United States, but it was Britain that had written the manual. For the families of those who perished, the technical triumphs meant little. They had buried husbands, wives, children and friends. Some never recovered the bodies of their loved ones. The sea had claimed them as its own. When investigators published their final report, it contained not only engineering analysis, but the weight of human grief. Every paragraph carried the echo of 35 passengers who had never landed. The engineers who read it knew that they could never undo what had been done. Their work could only ensure that it would never happen again. In the years after the crash, Farnborough became more than a testing ground. It became a shrine to accountability. The wreckage of Flight 781 remained on display for decades, not as a morbid exhibit, but as a lesson carved in metal. Students, pilots and engineers visited it as a rite of passage. They traced the torn edges of aluminum with their fingers, whispering questions that still had no easy answers. How could so many brilliant minds have missed something so simple? How many other dangers still hid inside the designs of the future? The comet's fall also exposed a cultural truth about progress. The faster humanity moves forward, the less time it spends looking backward. The rush to build, to innovate, to conquer the next frontier often leaves no room for humility. But the comet forced the world to pause. It demanded respect for the invisible, the unseen stresses, the quiet materials, the slow decay that accumulates flight after flight. It reminded us that technology, like the human body, can look flawless on the outside while breaking within. By the early 1960s, aviation had entered its golden age. Jetliners crisscrossed continents daily, carrying millions safely above the clouds. Passengers marveled at the comfort and speed, unaware that the shape of the window beside them, the gentle curve, the smooth edge, was born from the lessons of death. Every rounded window was a monument to the comet's victims, a silent apology from the industry that had failed them. In every airport, every departure board, the legacy of those crashes lived on, invisible but omnipresent. But inside Britain, the loss had left deeper scars. The once proud de Havilland Company, which had given the world the mosquito, the vampire, and the comet, began to fade. Mergers, financial troubles, and declining confidence slowly eroded its independence. By the end of the 1960s, it was absorbed into the larger Hawker Siddeley Group, and later into British Aerospace. The name de Havilland survived only in museums and textbooks, a ghost of innovation past. To those who had worked there, it felt like losing a part of themselves. "We built something the world had never seen," one engineer said in an interview years later, "and then we watched it disappear into the sea." The comet's legacy, however, was not only one of tragedy. It changed the culture of engineering forever. Before the comet, testing was empirical: build, fly, observe. After the comet, testing became scientific, predictive, mathematical. New fields of research emerged: fatigue analysis, structural redundancy, and non-destructive testing. Engineers began to see airplanes not as collections of parts, but as living systems, each component affecting the other. The dream of flight matured. It became disciplined. Government oversight also transformed. Aviation authorities around the world introduced new standards for certification. Aircraft would now undergo thousands of simulated pressurization cycles before carrying a single passenger. International cooperation between countries strengthened as data from one tragedy became prevention for another. The world had been forced to unite by loss. Out of destruction came structure. Even culture changed. The public, once intoxicated by the romance of air travel, began to view it with reverence. The jet age was still glamorous, but beneath the champagne and silver trays, there was a quiet awareness that every smooth takeoff carried a trace of danger. The comet had shown the cost of arrogance and the necessity of caution. The beauty of flight, it seemed, was inseparable from the weight of responsibility. As years turned into decades, the comet's name faded from headlines, but remained in whispers among those who understood its significance. Pilots still spoke of it with respect. The first, they would say, and the one that paid the price. Engineers invoked it during design reviews when warning against complacency. "Remember the comet," they would murmur, as if invoking an ancient prayer to keep disaster away. In 1998, on the 50th anniversary of the comet's first flight, a group of retired engineers gathered at Hatfield, the site where the original jet had been built. The airfield was quiet now, the hangars converted to offices and studios. They stood together in the cold morning light, grey-haired men and women staring at a restored comet parked outside. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of them broke the silence. "We changed the world," he said softly. Another nodded. "Yes," he replied, "but we learned too late." The conversation ended there, swallowed by the wind. The story of the comet is not just about an aircraft. It is about humanity's endless push toward the unknown and the price of getting there first. It is about courage and blindness, triumph and remorse. It is about the quiet moments in laboratories when metal begins to sing under pressure, and the deafening silence that follows when that song ends in tragedy. And above all, it is about memory, the kind of memory that never really fades. The sky keeps its secrets, but it also keeps its lessons. Every time a plane breaks through the clouds, it does so on the strength of knowledge paid for by those who came before. The comet's passengers may have vanished into the Mediterranean, but their legacy still flies every day in every aircraft that dares to chase the horizon. And somewhere, above the world, where the air grows thin and the sun burns cold, the echo of their engines still drifts across the sky. The sound is faint, but if you listen long enough, you can almost hear it. The sound of the future being born through fire, the sound of the past refusing to be forgotten. The sky remembers. Time has a way of softening memories, of turning even tragedy into history, but in the case of the comet, the memory refused to fade. For decades after the last flight, the name remained synonymous with both genius and heartbreak. To understand its legacy, one must look not only at the wreckage it left behind, but at the world it transformed. The comet's failure reshaped aviation so completely that every modern aircraft, from the sleek airliners that cross the Pacific to the whispering private jets that skim the stratosphere, carries within its frame the DNA of those doomed flights. In the years following the disaster, the world's engineers absorbed the lessons with religious devotion. Testing became ritual. Precision became doctrine. New alloys replaced old metals, redundancy replaced trust, and every inch of a plane S-body became a question to be answered before the first passenger ever stepped aboard. The invisible became visible. Stress, fatigue, vibration, air pressure, all charted, measured, understood. The mistakes that destroyed the comet became the foundations of an entire science. Humanity had paid for knowledge in blood, and it would never forget the price. Yet progress is a strange thing. As the comet's lessons made the skies safer, its story began to slip into the background of history. The world moved on, captivated by the glamour of the jet age. The Boeing 707 dominated the skies through the 1960s, followed by the 747, the DC-10, and eventually the Concorde, the supersonic descendant of everything de Havilland had dreamed of. Each new aircraft carried mankind further and faster, but none could escape the shadow of that first British jet that fell apart in silence. Engineers could not speak of the future without invoking its ghost. The Concorde, in many ways, was the spiritual heir of the comet. It represented once again Britain's and France's attempt to lead the world into the next chapter of aviation. It was sleek, beautiful and ambitious, a reminder that even after failure, humanity could dream again. But within its sharp nose and delta wings, there was humility. The engineers who designed the Concorde understood that no dream was worth repeating the same mistakes. Every panel, every bolt, every window curve was calculated to withstand the invisible pressures that had destroyed the comet. The ghosts of the 1950s still whispered through the wind tunnels of the 1970s. For the passengers who would later board the Concorde, the experience felt transcendent. Crossing the Atlantic in half the time, watching the curvature of the Earth from 60,000 feet. But behind that luxury was discipline, the legacy of hard-earned caution. Each sonic boom that echoed across the ocean was also an echo of the comet's explosion, a reminder that the laws of physics do not forgive arrogance. Every triumph in aviation carries the weight of its own ancestors. As decades passed, aviation safety reached heights once thought impossible. By the dawn of the 21st century, commercial air travel had become statistically safer than driving a car. The names of tragedies, Tenerife, Lockerbie Malaysia 370 stood out precisely because they had become so rare. And yet, in every investigation, in every analysis of twisted metal and burned wires, the same principle guided the work. Find the truth before it repeats itself. The blueprint for that pursuit had been written in 1954 in the wreckage of the Comet. The wreckage itself still exists. In a museum in England under cold fluorescent light, the reconstructed fuselage of Flight 781 sits in silence. Visitors walk past, some pausing to read the placard, others moving on. To most, it is just another relic of the past. But for those who know, the air feels heavier there. You can almost sense the echoes trapped in the metal. The pressure of altitude, the final breath before the tear, the shockwave of air escaping into space. The comet still speaks, but only to those who listen. In 2009, a retired engineer named Alan Webb visited the exhibit with his grandson. Webb had been a young technician at Farnborough during the investigation. He stood there for a long time, staring at the torn aluminum skin, the circular test windows, the black and white photos on the wall. His grandson, barely 10 years old, tugged at his sleeve. "Grandad," he asked, "did you help build it?" Webb nodded slowly. "We all did," he said, "in one way or another." The boy looked puzzled. "But didn't it fall?" Webb smiled sadly. "Yes, but because it fell, everything else learned to fly." That conversation captures the paradox at the heart of the comet's story. Progress does not move in straight lines. It stumbles, it breaks, it bleeds. The price of knowledge is often paid by those who never live to see its reward. The passengers of the comet, the engineers who designed it, the investigators who rebuilt it piece by piece, all became part of a single story, the story of humanity daring to leap into the unknown. And like all great leaps, it came with consequences. Even today, when a modern jet pierces the sky, its pressurized cabin flexes just slightly with every ascent and descent. Sensors monitor microscopic cracks invisible to the naked eye. Engineers analyze stress data in real time. The lessons of the comet live not in textbooks, but in the heartbeat of every flight. The round window beside a passenger S-head is a quiet monument to those who looked out through square ones and never came home. Every takeoff, every safe landing is a salute to them, silent but enduring. And so, the story of the comet ends where it began, with hope. The same hope that filled the hearts of those first passengers in 1952, stepping into the unknown with faith in human invention. They could not know that their flight would end in tragedy, but because of them, millions now cross oceans safely every day. They were the first to trust the sky, and the sky in time learned to hold that trust. There is a saying among pilots: every rule in aviation is written in blood. It is not a statement of despair, but of respect. The comet's rule was perhaps the most important of all. Never underestimate the invisible. Never forget that air, though unseen, is a force as powerful as steel. Never stop listening to what the metal tries to tell you. The engineers of tomorrow still study those same fractures, those same reports, learning how not to repeat the past. The comet has become more than a machine. It is a lesson, eternal and unending. And so, as another generation of aircraft takes to the skies, quiet, efficient and safe, they do so carrying a legacy forged in silence and loss. Each flight is a continuation of that unfinished conversation between mankind and the heavens. The planes have changed, the technology has evolved, but the message remains the same. Respect the sky, because the sky remembers. It always remembers.